I want to read to you this morning a little bit more of Acts, Paul's last visit to Troas. You might remember in dealing with Acts, we have been wading through big travelogues, whole half chapters or chapters of Paul did this and Paul went there and all that sort of thing. This is just a few verses, and this is a wonderful passage. And I want you to let God speak to you from this word. And because it's a very few verses, I'm going to read it, pause, and I'm going to read it again. Because it's a great passage. Just let God speak to you. On Saturday evening, we gathered together for the fellowship meal. Paul spoke to the people and kept on speaking until midnight, since he was going to leave the next day. Many lamps were burning in the upstairs room where we were meeting. A young man named Eutychus was sitting in the window, and as Paul kept on talking, Eutychus got sleepier and sleepier until he finally went sound asleep and fell from the third story to the ground. When they picked him up, he was dead. But Paul went down and threw himself on him and hugged him. "Don't worry," he said, "he is still alive." Then he went back upstairs, broke bread and ate. And after talking with them for a long time, even until sunrise, Paul left. And they took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. Just hear that again. On the Saturday evening, we gathered together for the fellowship meal. Paul spoke to the people and kept on speaking until midnight, since he was going to leave the next day. Many lamps were burning in the upstairs room where we were meeting. A young man named Eutychus was sitting in the window, and as Paul kept on talking, Eutychus got sleepier and sleepier until he finally went sound asleep and fell from the third story to the ground. When they picked him up, he was dead. But Paul went down and threw himself on him and hugged him. "Don't worry," he said, "he is still alive." Then he went back upstairs, took bread and ate. And after talking with them for a long time, even until sunrise, Paul left. And they took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. There's so much to just look at in this lovely little passage, if nothing else, about dropping off during the sermon. But at least you're on the ground, aren't you? You're only going to drop off into the carpet. Wow. There's just a whole range of bits and pieces I want to share with you, and some of you want to pick up, it's just for you this morning, and some it's just for somebody else, and don't worry about that. But first thing I really want to say is that this is a great pattern for how to be a Christian in a Christian community. As a church here, we can learn from this. As Christians here, as individuals, you can learn. Even if you're visiting us, if you're a Christian, you belong to a church, if you want to join us, this is the deal sort of thing. It's good to know how it is in the New Testament church. It gives you a pattern. And what I like about this, setting aside the miracle for a minute, is that all the things that they do are eminently doable. For instance, they meet together. You say, oh, that's pretty obvious. But everywhere Paul goes and everywhere the apostles go, they meet together. They are a meeting people. I mean, when Jesus was with people, they met together. And you might say, well, that's a bit of a truism. But it is a distinctive feature of a Christian that they meet with other Christians, that there is a meeting community. And that to be a community is not just feel affinity, but to be near to people, to actually meet together. Well, you say we've done that this morning. But that is an important thing. We are a meeting. We are coming together. And we live in a society where nobody wants to really meet anymore. A society used to be all meetings, but it isn't anymore. It's an atomized society of individuals and individuals' rights and personal space and doing your own thing. You know, you don't even sort of meet anybody when you're shopping anymore, do you? You just go in automatically. You don't even, you scan it, you know, and all you meet is that wretched machine that says, unidentified object in the bagging area. That is the nearest thing you get to a social gathering, isn't it? And people, they say, whether it's a church, but particularly whether it's a group, I don't know, a conservation group, a political group, a group trying to do social justice, or even a sports group. People like to do it, but they don't want to join. Everybody wants to be in the Scouts, but nobody wants to run the Scouts anymore. And so it's a distinctive thing to be in a Christian community that we actually do meet together. And I think we might feel, well, we are Christians and we have a personal spirituality, but meeting is a nice thing to do for the worship. But meeting together, many of you in this congregation do not know one another very well. Many of you do not know even what somebody else on the other side of the church is called. We are called to meet together, And some of you meet in home groups, but my impression of home groups in the past has always been that they are really good meetings, but the general church thinks that they are evening classes for enthusiasts. So that most people don't meet in home groups, In fact, most people don't meet at all, except here. And then if you can't come every week, that's really only 1 hour a fortnight or half an hour a week, which is not a lot of meeting. So if it's a distinctive thing that we meet, perhaps we ought to think about meeting a bit more. Because if Jesus meets with his people when they meet, and you want to meet with Jesus, it's not all about personal spirituality. To meet is a dynamic thing. There's nothing more boring than going to a meeting. You know what I mean? Meetings are not always places where you meet. You just sit in the same room and share an agenda. But to meet is to have an affinity with people, to come together. Perhaps you might like to think about that. People you might meet, people you might get together with. I think it's important for us. And we read then that they were sharing in the breaking of the bread. The Greek here is very much Holy Communion. Now, it's extraordinary that actually in this service, which is the most contemporary service of all the services in the 18 churches in this circuit, we do communion more than anybody else. And that came by chance originally, but actually I feel it's important. Our forefathers did not do this. This pulpit was in the middle and the communion table was hid round the back. It was all about the word, and once a month, or even in the 19th century, once a quarter, you took communion. And in fact, when I was a boy, there was the end of the service, there was a benediction, then people left before the communion service. This is a central thing, because as those people in Troas meet, they meet not just with Paul, but they meet with Jesus. They encountered Jesus. This is the center. And as they meet with him, the old sort of a metaphor of a maypole with all the ribbons, they are joined together in the circle because they are joined with Jesus. And as they go round and round and round, they come nearer to the pole and Jesus, but they come nearer and nearer to one another. And so in communion, and those of you who and I encourage you to just pray a little prayer here on the rail and do some business with Jesus before you return to your seats. If there's enough of you, you go shoulder to shoulder, looking for spaces on the rail, Brings us to Jesus, brings us together. It's central. I was thinking about this and I thought, when we had Remembrance Day, because it was a big civic service and it started early, this service was curtailed. And what did we leave out? I left out the communion. I should have left out the sermon, because this is central, it's not peripheral. It's great they met for that. And then they met to be taught. Oh, and by the way, I just was going to say this. Those of you who meet in groups, with permission and good church order, I encourage you to share communion in a home group. I encourage you to do that, Anytime you meet, central to it. Teaching, they met and he taught them all night. Now, Paul is a good teacher. We know that from his letters. Paul was a good orator. He was a good expositor. And you know what he'd been saying? He'd been talking about Jesus as the Son of God, as the Messiah, who died on the cross, that our sins can be forgiven. All that Roman stuff, the gospel of salvation. So it's really good stuff. In fact, the way that Luke speaks about this, and he speaks about it very intimately, Luke, we, lots of details. I was in the upper room on the 3rd floor, sort of thing. It's almost as if he wants to say, and it was very stuffy, and there were all these candles, and there was all these lamps. In other words, Eutychus didn't fall asleep because Paul was boring. So that's a sort of a subtext, you see. And he wouldn't have been boring. I wouldn't go to anybody to go anywhere to listen all night. You wouldn't want to listen to me all night, you know. It's good stuff. But we need to be people who are addressed by good stuff that is the word of Jesus. As a church, I want you to be taught. If you feel you're not being taught, tell me. If other people stand here and they don't teach you, we'll move them. We need to be people who are taught. And it's the same with your home groups. You need people to teach the gospel, not just have a little chat about what you've been doing in the week. And even if you can do so, if you're reading something or get something on the internet, on God channels or something like that, be taught, because to be taught is to hear the word of God. They don't just meet together because it's nice. They meet together to be taught. You see, that's another characteristic. And just the fourth characteristic is that they then ate. Now, after the miracle, they ate. The Greek is different. It is not breaking bread formally in the communion. It's just eating, because you've got to eat to last the night. I find this particularly interesting. Jesus eats a lot, doesn't he, in his life. If you want to meet with me, let's have a meal. Anybody who's not keen on eating does not feed 5,000 people when, okay, they were a bit hungry on the way home, but it's not necessary. And that eating, he says, sit them down in groups on the grass, because that is a fellowship. He doesn't say, this is fast food. Make them all line up, give them a food, and they can go home. Sit them down. There is a fellowship here. Let's eat together, he says, with his disciples. And I think we need to get this idea that eating together is not a social action on the edge of what the church does. Eating together is a place to meet one another and to meet with Jesus. Because Jesus liked eating, I need to like eating, all right? It's not a peripheral thing. It's not just, as we might be sometimes thinking, shall we have a harvest supper this year, sort of thing. I've had discussions over the years with Alpha courses and even with the Bible course. Do we need the food before the course? Well, yes, but actually it is a different thing when you eat together, I think. And it's a great thing that we have this business where we meet up at Wetherspoons once a month on a Monday morning for breakfast. But if the Lord is in the midst of that, the Lord is in the midst of Wetherspoons, and Wetherspoons needs that, And it's great to meet together. You're in home groups. What about if every 6 or 8 weeks you ate together? You went out together, What about the band? What about every 2 or 3 months we went out together to eat together rather than just sing together, Sort of thing. And the women's fellowship, they're going out for a tea. That's great. But perhaps bringing that together. How many of us, and I'm not a good example of this because I've got to go and preach at Gulville straight afterwards. How many of you zoom off? Because we've done the worship, I've got to rush off. Perhaps I'm going to have coffee somewhere else. Perhaps I need to go and do something else. Some of you will, but that's not the point. What about if we all stayed? Would that not be part of the worship? Would that not be part of the church? And if we produce coffee in the variety we get in a coffee shop and donuts, and we all stayed, because that is what we do. I think it's very interesting. And they ate. So you see, we meet together, we do communion together, we are taught together, we eat together. And in so doing, Jesus in our midst. That's a great pattern just in there. Second sort of thing is this whole business of an all-nighter. I'm not good at all. I've done army exercises all night. The army love all-night exercises. It's terrible. I have been to the occasional all-night party. About 4 o'clock, you think, I want to be lying down somewhere asleep. But if you've got those, you'll have all been to parties where it's all night and the ticket includes breakfast, And you think, I better wait for breakfast. I want to go to bed, So perhaps you haven't, perhaps you were brought up better than me. But anyway. It's a big thing, isn't it? It's a big sacrifice. And there is in this little group of people in Troas, a tremendous, passionate focus. You've got to be focused to stay up all night to listen to Paul, with all those people packed into that room. Probably a big room because there's a third story, so it'd be a big building in those days, That passion, do you have that passion to hear the word, to be with God's people and to meet with Jesus? I mean, St. Paul's a great speaker, but in lots of places nobody wanted to hear. We'll hear you another time. Paul, you are beside yourself. They don't want to hear. It's no good just having a lot of good stuff if you don't want to hear it. Do you have a passion to hear, to be with, to encounter Jesus? Taste and see that the Lord is good. I often don't have that passion, but if we try this a little bit, we find that the passion rises. That's good. That's why I want to stay here. They are not completely put off by somebody falling out the window and killing themselves. That is extraordinary. They don't pick him up, start all that sort of classical wailing you've got in that area of that mourning, lift him onto the shoulders of the young men and take him home. They don't do that. They don't despair. They don't give up. This is an amazing passage for us. If you feel that to be focused on Jesus, to hear his word and to be with his people will immunize you from bad things happening in your life, read this. This is a really bad thing that happens when everybody's doing a good thing. They are all there hearing the word of the Lord and somebody dies. It shouldn't be happening. It shouldn't be happening. Elijah says this, doesn't he? Why could you do this and kill this boy about that widow's boy? How dare you, he says. They used to be more frank in the Old Testament. But you know what I mean? You are following Jesus and something happens wrong. Well, somebody is ill, badly ill, but it's such a good person, or some disaster happens, or, that shouldn't be happening because I'm seeking the Lord. I'm focusing on God. I should be all right. Well, how would his mother have thought if this had just gone through and he was dead? Eutyche is his mother. No, she would have said, no, St. Paul didn't kill him. But if he hadn't gone to the meeting, he'd be alive. Do I survive bad things happening when I'm focusing on Jesus? Do we as a church survive bad things happening when we're focusing on Jesus? Otherwise we're put off. Everything falls to pieces. We go and do something else. Hold that focus. But I think the focus is also to do with the fact that there's a priority here. We read, because that day he was going to depart the next day. And that was the last opportunity in Troas that they would ever have to hear St. Paul. I'd have stayed up all night if that was the last time. If he was going to be speaking in the same place here next week, okay, let's go home and come back next week, sort of thing. And so within a Christian community and for us as individuals, we need to add to the fact that we all know that the gospel is important, the idea that the gospel is urgent, that we need to hear it now. This morning is a unique occasion. Between now and next week, you might be hit by a truck. But also, between now and next week, there will be changes to all of you. Where you are sitting, and the combination of those of you who are here, is a unique occasion. This will never, ever be replicated. Even if we got all the same people here, you'd be sitting in a slightly different place. And I would not be saying the same thing. In fact, I would have thought in the next 18 months, I will never preach to you about Eutychus again. So these are unique occasions. What has the Lord got to say to you today? Next week, he'll say something else to you. There is an urgency to hear. And so we are passionate about it. I just want to finish then by a word about the miracle. You might have thought, when is he going to get round to the miracle? But this is not a miracle story. It's a story with a miracle in it. It's not like one of the Pauline, the Johannine signs. It is a great miracle. It's very similar to the miracles of Elijah and Elisha in the Old Testament. He falls down, he's dead. There's a nice soft mat of grass in the Middle East. You fall out of a third-story window head first, you are dead. And even if it says, well, he's not yet dead. You remember with Jesus, when he raises Jairus' daughter, he said, she is only asleep. That's the way they speak in the Middle East. They laughed him to scorn and he raised her. This is a resurrection thing. But even if it wasn't, it's still a miracle. Perhaps we shouldn't quite always draw such a firm line between praying for people who are terminally ill and people who've just died. Perhaps God doesn't quite see it like that. But whatever it is, it's a miracle. And you notice how straightforward it is. St. Paul stops what he's doing. It's extraordinary, St. Paul. But St. Paul stops what he's doing. He goes down and he commits himself to the healing. He doesn't say, like I might have said, well, ring for the ambulance and we'll continue praying for you. Sort of intercession. You know, he goes down. He doesn't just sort of wave a charismatic hand at him. He actually puts himself right on it. We're going to be a healing here or we're not having a healing. So there is a straightforward commitment. Never whitewash the miracle out of this. God intervenes. But the important thing about the story is that it shows us that the church is really a community in which miracles happen. Not that you just take it for granted, but it's not a drama miracle in the sense of a sign. It's more of an ordinary miracle to deal with a need. A bit like Peter's mother-in-law, and Jesus went back to the house and she was ill and there was no supper and he healed her and then there was supper. It was a kind of a common to garden thing within the community of the church. They don't just meet and have communion. There are miracles. Or you could say, well, perhaps all of it's miracle. We meet together and Jesus comes, that's a miracle. There's communion, it's a miracle. He speaks from his word to you, that's a miracle. You have a meal together, he makes himself obvious, that's a miracle. And somebody ill or dead and he heals them, it's a miracle. It will be silly to say it's just part of the story. Resurrections do stand out in the evening, don't they? But you see what I'm saying? It's part of the narrative. And in fact, as we get later on, when Paul leaves people, we could have had this story without Eutychus. I think we need to learn that we don't just have to have miracles with fireworks. We don't have to just have healing services. We don't even have to have special teams for healing. But we need to be a community in which, within the narrative of our lives, miracles happen. They will never be common to garden. Miracles are not like that, but they will fit in. In fact, without them, it wouldn't be the same. It was very much a good thing for Eutychus and his family, this miracle, wasn't it? But it was also a good thing for the church because St. Paul could then carry on and go on preaching. A picture I'll leave you with about miracles is sometimes when you've seen explorers, perhaps on glaciers in the mountains or in Antarctica, they're moving across the ice and they get to a great big crevasse. The crevasse is where there is no ice, isn't it? And they get one of these aluminium ladders out, and they put it across the crevasse and walk across the ladder and then keep going. The miracle is a bit like the ladder on the bit that's not there, It helps you move on. Remember when Peter was got out of jail? It was good news for Peter because he wasn't executed the next morning. But the kingdom moved on across the gap. And thus Peter could go on to preach and to teach and to found the church. We need, in our own lives and life of our church, to be people where miracles happen and where God moves us on across the crevasse and takes us on. And they were greatly comforted when they went home. I would have been. But there's an encouragement that we have a supernatural foundation, whether it's worshipping with the music or in the communion or eating together or getting donuts or whatever it is. Miracles do happen. And so you're in a home group and you've been worshipping and somebody's, something quite small. Got a really painful joint in the arthritis this week. We'll pray for you. We'll lay hands on you. And it just becomes part. Not a funny part, just a part of what is a total supernatural thing. So there's a lot in that little story. And we're going to come to communion now, which is, as you can gather, more important than what I've just said. To meet with the Lord, to meet with one another. To be together. To go shoulder to shoulder at the communion rail. And then to drink coffee afterwards. The band are going to come and play for us. Jesus be the centre. Huge thing. Be the wind in my sails. It's no good as a church. It was no good for them in Troas. It's no good for us pulling up the sails if there's no wind. Let's stand together, shall we?